ahead and bring on our presenters for today. We have Jennifer Lehman, President and CEO of Mission Advancement. Jennifer has been a fundraising consultant since 1997. She loves building relationships with nonprofit leaders and helping them reach their potential and achieve their big goals. And we have Jamie Ritter, CEO of Mission Allies. Jamie has more than 20 years of nonprofit leadership experience. She and her team focus on grant writing and helping organizations build a robust and relational foundation strategy. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you, Shannon. It's great to be back. We've been kind of out of the webinar circuit, feels like, for a little bit, and wanted to bring one more topic before the end of the year and introduce you guys, the Mission Advancement folks on today, to Jamie Ritter, if you are not familiar with her and her team, and talk really specifically about this foundation strategy and how grants can be a part of a good overall development plan. So Jamie and I are going to be doing kind of a Q&A model today. I'm going to be asking her some questions and letting her talk a little bit about her experience and the way that she counsels organizations in this area. I'll talk a little bit more about it at the end, about how we are working together. But in 2021, we began doing some collaborative work with Mission Allies, primarily because their philosophy around the foundation relationships and how to build a sustainable grants model very much aligns with our philosophy around individual donors. So you're going to see a lot of similarities if you've been a part of our webinars in the past. When it comes to how we approach individuals, in a very similar way, Jamie's team builds a grants model that mirrors that kind of philosophy. So we're going to dive right into the content so that we get as much time as possible. Here's our faces, if you need that slide. But I'm going to just talk really quickly about what we mean by relational grants strategy, just to kind of get us all on the same page at the beginning. So there's a few things here, but I'm going to go right to the bottom, to the last bullet point, which is probably a phrase many of us in the fundraising world have heard. And this, what I call spray and pray approach, is one way to tackle the foundations within your area. What we are talking about today is really the opposite of that. And the 4 bullets, at the top really describe the keys to building this kind of a relational model. So it's not just a numbers game. There are folks out there who will say, oh, just submit 50 applications a month or 500 applications a year, whatever might be the right number, and you're sure to hit some, just play the odds. And what we're going to talk about is a very different way to go about this that's more strategic, going deeper with fewer, similar to how we teach on the individual side, and a much more of a focus on relationship building and sustainability. So this is what we mean by relational grant strategy. And there's 5 things we're going to cover today that play into building this model. So we're going to talk about the research that goes on the front end, how to build a pipeline of foundations and what a pipeline should look like, what relationship building looks like with foundation executives and board members, the writing itself, the nuts and bolts, which is one component, but certainly not the only. And then the last is what I've just called stewardship or reporting. And just like with individuals, the key here is that we want to exceed expectations. In order to have sustainable funding, we want the foundation to feel like their gift was utilized well, that we are responsive and managing the relationship well. So these are the 5 areas we're going to dig into today. And I'm just going to start right off with research and have Jamie talk a little bit about what the process and best practices are for good quality research with any organization, big or small, as you begin to think about which foundations are a fit for you. So here's a few talking points, but Jamie, this is your time to kind of share with the group your findings on research.
Excellent. So you can write the best proposal in the world, but if you haven't done your research on the back end, you're likely to fail. So research comes down to knowing who your ideal funder is. But before I go into that, I want to back up just a little bit. So unless you're from a very large nonprofit that can afford Foundation Center and Grant Station and Instrumental or one of those, you're probably doing your research on the IRS website or GuideStar, you're looking at 990s. And I research for hundreds of groups every year, and I start with 990s. I have access to every database that there is, but the vast majority of what I do still comes from those 990s. So just because you don't have access to one of the large, big websites, don't think that you're starting behind. You're starting right where everyone else starts. But before you do that, you need to be able to identify who your ideal donor is. And if you can't answer that question, whether it's from an individual standpoint or a foundation standpoint, you're not ready for fundraising. Because I might say my ideal donor is anyone that gives to children. But in reality, when I start researching foundations, there are very specific components within the children's category that funders are interested in. So you need to have a broad idea of who that ideal donor is before you even get in to start researching. I don't need to spend hours researching one foundation if they don't meet my ideal funder category. And then once I know that, I can get in and start sorting by organizations that are interested in kids. Once I start narrowing it down to say, okay, I'm going to look at anyone that's interested in children's causes. I'm going to start looking at who have they funded in the past? Are they funding my competition? Within my competition, are they funding one of them or are they funding all of them? Typically what you'll find is that if a funder only funds one organization within a specific space, often they consider that area funded. For instance, we write for a prison reentry program, and there is a large national organization that loves to fund prison reentry, but they have picked one group within that, and they're not interested in any other prison reentry programs. So we know that because we've picked up the phone and called them, and they've said that. So look at that. That's going to guide your research as to when you're going to pick up the phone. If they're funding all of your competitors and not you, it's likely that they're interested in that cause versus that agency. And then we want to look at how do we fit within what they're funding. Does my program fit within what they state they like to do? When I first started doing this in the late 90s, no one had a website. So everything was from their 990 or word of mouth or relationship. Now, most of these funders are giving you some guidelines as to what they like. They've launched a website, they're at least giving you some initial introduction to who they are. So is what I'm doing a match for what they're interested in? One of the starts to research is not to chase money. So if my program is sound, my methodology is sound, my logic model is sound, I should not have to change the core of my program to fit a funder's interest. That's money that's never going to be sustainable. I might change it this year, but if it's not in line with my mission and I'm simply chasing money, there's not going to be the true relationship build that we want to have as we're working through our research. So we're looking at, is this a funder match? Does my client population match? Is my location a fit? Is what I'm doing in the space? Does everything point to that as I'm looking through what my funders like to fund? Then I'm going to say, okay, I've targeted these 5 funders. I think that we're a good match for everything. What are my relationship contact points? So I'm going to pull their board rosters. I'm going to pull the organizations that they're currently funding, and I'm going to distribute that to my board. I'm going to distribute it to my development committee. I'm going to just develop it, send it out to anyone who has the potential to join me on this journey. I want to know who my board knows. I want to know who my development committee knows, and I want to know how they know them. Do they go to church together every Sunday? Do they have coffee once a week? Are they golfing buddies? That's going to bump them up in who's going to go into my research. So if I know that with Foundation A, I have 6 contacts, I'm going to work on that foundation more than I'm going to work on Foundation B, where I have 1 contact or no contact. So factor that in when you're doing your research of who am I going to have the best opportunity with building a relationship with as I work through that model.
That's awesome. Hey, Jamie, can I back up 1 second. At the very beginning, you threw out several names of databases or a couple of names. So for organizations that may not be familiar, can you just name those again and talk about which ones are more applicable or affordable for small organizations versus ones that are probably better for the large organization?
Okay, so Foundation Center and Grant Station are two that come up frequently. Grant Station holds 2 sales events a year, and they become extremely affordable if you can target it during those periods. I use them for specific focus grants. I think that they are probably better for your smaller organizations. Foundation Center is one that has been around a long time. It tends to be more expensive. You also can buy in at different levels. So if you are not interested in the full stats and you just need intro, there's some entry levels that are very good. Instrumental is a newer one that I have started using, newer to me, and I like it for national research and topic research. So it is another one that you can set up alerts on certain topics. So if you aren't able to be on all the mailing lists for every foundation everywhere, you can set up alerts, and when a new grant comes out, it will shoot you an alert on a topic in your area. There's many others that are great as well. Those are just the 3 that I tend to use most often.
Awesome. And then you mentioned searching for 990s, which is something all of us can do. So obviously you can do that organically, and I Google all the time, looking for a specific organization's 990. But is there, I think you mentioned GuideStar, is that the go-to source, or any other that is a good source for 990s?
So I go directly to the IRS website. There is I have it bookmarked in my web files, and they tend to be the most updated source for things that are filed. They've been a bit behind during COVID, so it's taken them just a bit longer, but that's typically where I pull the 990 itself. I go to GuideStar to also see if the agency has updated anything on their stats and statistics, but those tend to be the 2 that I use most frequently. And GuideStar, you can have a free membership, so it's easy to log in and access the data easily.
Awesome. Okay, well, let's keep going to make sure we get to all of our questions. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about pipeline. And again, similar to your individual donor work, on the foundation side, you want to make sure that you've got a robust pipeline, and a pipeline that gives you good information about kind of what your next steps are and how you're going to hit, hopefully, your target for any given year. So Jamie, talk to us a little bit about how you counsel organizations around building this pipeline, and maybe what you see as sort of the biggest challenges.
Once again, we go back to, if you're a large nonprofit, you probably have your database and your CRM and your electronic in every format for your grant pipeline. If you're a small organization, you're starting out right where I'm starting out. I start everything in Excel. I have an amazing and fabulous database, and it ends up going in there eventually. But when I'm doing my initial research and I'm creating my initial timeline, it's in Excel. So everyone has the basic tool to get started. And your timeline, I prefer to do them, you can do them according to your fiscal year, or you can do them according to your calendar year. I tend to focus on a calendar year because that's how most funders think with their deadlines when they're posting deadlines. And I look at, who am I going to ask during the year? What is the ideal strategy for when that ask is going to be submitted? And then what's the legwork that needs to be done both before and after? So on my spreadsheet, I'm going to start out by saying, okay, this is my annual spreadsheet. According to my research, these are the 50 foundations that I'm going to go to this year. I'm going to timeline those out. So of the 50, 25 have set deadlines. I want to target to have that submitted the month before the deadline. For the ones that don't have set deadlines, I'm going to look at what months I'm low and say, okay, my spring cycle's heavy, so some of these others I'm going to submit in the summer or the fall, depending on my workload. One main purpose for this document, this timeline, no matter where you keep it, is so that everyone who's involved with the grant process knows what to expect. I tell everyone when I do my annual pipeline that it's a living and breathing document. It is going to shift, but I want everyone to know what I'm planning to do throughout the year. That way, when I present it to my board and I say, here's the 50 foundations we're going to, if they're in Sunday school and they hear that so-and-so is at their Sunday school and they're with the XYZ Foundation, I want it to ping, oh my goodness, we're going to send a request into them some point this year. They pull up their spreadsheet and then they're able to say, okay, well, I met this person. I can say this organization that I support is going to submit a request. So I want everyone to have an idea of who we're targeting that year. It may shift. That's what we're going to talk about, but it gives everyone a broad idea of where to go. On that, I also want everyone that's involved to know what my plan is for an ask amount and what I'm going to target for the ask. Am I going for general operating? Am I going for something program specific? And what is my ask amount? All of my research tells me that the first time a funder funds an organization, they typically give in this range. So I'm going to target that for my first ask. Or maybe this is our second or third funding opportunity they've given to me a couple times. I'm going to grow that ask. I want that to be noted as well. I also want funder history easily noted. If I've gone to this organization 3 times and they've declined me every time, but this year my board member knows someone on that foundation, I want my board member to be very well prepped when they have that conversation. I want them to be able to say, look, I know you turned us down before, maybe we weren't a perfect fit. We want to come in with a different ask. How do you see us as being able to fit? If that board member doesn't have that history, they're going in blind, whether they funded you before or not. So that donor history is very important when you're working through your timeline. The other thing I like to note on my timelines is who owns that funder. So who has the best relationship and who's going to lead the charge with that funder. It comes down to the right person making the right ask at the right time. I want to set them up for success. So is that my executive director? Is that my board member with me as a second, making sure that everything gets accomplished on that timeline? But those are high level, what I like to make sure is on my timeline that's going to go out to everyone that has a stake within the grant writing space.
Yep. That's awesome. And this seems very simple, but I'm sure Jamie can attest, as can I, working with organizations. This type of a very simple tracking tool is just often not in place. And the only thing I would add is that this is also critical for potential turnover in your organization. So if this is not a document that lives in a common space with multiple people who understand it and have access, if you have a grant writer or a development director that owns this and they leave, and this is not tightened up, it becomes a start over process for whoever comes next. So it sounds very simple, but critical not only for tracking and everything Jamie just said, but for the potential of turnover. Okay, so let's get to my favorite topic, relationship building. No shock to anybody there. So a lot of times, again, that spray and pray method doesn't lend itself to relationship building, and people don't often think about foundations as a target for relationship building. But we know that's not true. And I want Jamie to talk a little bit about what that looks like in the foundation space, knowing that it is different from individual donors. So talk more about how we do this with foundations.
So it always surprises me when I talk to development people that are very strong with individual donors and they're scared to pick up the phone for a foundation. And sure, there are people with probably more money at their disposal than you personally have, but at their core, foundations are people. And you need to steward that person the same way as you would an individual donor. There are a few things that we like to tweak and a few things that we like to do differently, but overall, remember that the person running that foundation is someone that you can create a relationship with. Another point that we like to tell everyone is foundations are in the business of giving away money. They need to give money away. You need the money. It's a match. So just like you're trying to make a match with an individual donor, you're saying, here's my different program components, which of these interest you? I feel like this would be a passion area for you. It's very similar with building that relationship with the foundation. We want it to mirror our individual work. We want to make sure that our ask is in line with what they want. And we want to help them find the right cause to give their money to. So when you're working on cultivating a donor relationship with a foundation, you're going to mirror what you do with individuals, probably to a slightly different degree, but somewhat similar. That phone call, always important. If the foundation has a website and they have a phone number, make the call. You're going to talk to a receptionist, you're going to ask who you need to speak to, and you're going to make your way through the pipeline. But you want your name to be familiar when it comes to that grant cycle. If you're submitting a cold app, they know nothing about you, they only have what's in paper, you're not going to get as much recognition as you are if you made that phone call, you introduced yourself. And maybe the outcome is they say you're not a fit for us at this time. Great, you saved yourself an entire grant application. So make that call, start the introductions. You're going to start cultivating them the same way that you would an individual that has not made a gift yet. So I would tell you to check their website. If they prefer not to be called, they're going to state that. Obviously, go by what they state. Some foundations do want an application before they'll speak to you, and they will state that directly on their website or their 990. So follow their guidelines, right? Just because your stewardship and cultivation plan says you call first, make sure you tweak that if they specifically state something else that they want to happen within that process. And then once again, it's involve the right people. So if my board member golfs with this person once a week, he needs to be the one that makes that call and says, hey, this group's going to submit a grant application. I'm on their board. I strongly support what they're doing. Please feel free to reach out to me with any questions. So we want to make sure that it's the right person making that cultivation call as well as making the request. And then, sorry, lost track. Mission focused, right? I guess this goes back to research in 101, right? So we're looking to build relationships with foundations that are interested in our mission. Everyone wants to build a relationship with Bill Gates, but to be honest, he's probably not interested in your mission. So you're going to spend a lot of time trying to cultivate and build a gift from him when you could focus on the foundations that are in your area already interested in your mission and are worth going after. So look at that mission focus in everything that you do.
Yep. Any tips, Jamie, for what that first call sounds like when if they haven't said don't call, which I agree, if they don't say anything, then assume that you can call. And when I make that call, are there any kind of initial questions that you recommend people ask in that very first interaction?
Do your research. So know what they're interested in, know who else they fund, know what amount they fund in, and then it's your first date, right? So I want you to know a little bit about me. So typically when I call, I start out with who I am, who I'm with, and then how I think it's a match. So I was on your website and I saw that you like to fund in this area. I saw that you fund, 2 other organizations that are similar. We have a unique spin on it. I wanted to tell you about that. And then, see if you had any questions or see if you think we might be a fit for what you do. So typically after you start with that little elevator pitch, the foundation person has questions that are going to determine if you're a match. They're going to help you lead that conversation. But it's your first date. They're going to say, I don't think we're a fit in that category, but you mentioned X, or, we've given out all of our funding for this year, but I would love to talk to you again in the spring. So it's your initial blind date session, but always start with that mission. And if you've done your research and you can tie it back to how you fit with their funding, it's always a good launching point. Yep.
The other thing I've encouraged CEOs in particular, or whoever the right person is to ask, will you do a site visit? Because usually that's a yes or no question, and they're either very comfortable with that. And to Jamie's point about staying mission focused, if you can get them on site to see your mission in action, if that's something you can do, then that's a step that you'd love to take. So just finding out if that's something they're open to and when that might be appropriate is a great thing to explore at the very beginning. Okay, to keep going. So the next step then is writing, which we think about as a very obvious piece, the nuts and bolts of how we do this. But what I want Jamie to really focus on is how to do this better and how to stand out from the competition. So, some people do a really fabulous job here. Others tend to just try to follow the rules the best they can, submit, and hope for the best. So, Jamie, as you think about what you see in this area, here are some things you and I have talked about, but what would you share as the most critical pieces for people to consider?
I would say to start, you don't have to consider yourself a writer to be successful in grant writing. There are people who never take that step of actually writing the grant because they say, I'm not a writer, it's not going to be perfect. I've seen grants that are poorly written in terms of grammar and the way things flow get funded because you have that mission match and because they believe in the passion in what you do. So spend time, follow the basics, but just because you don't consider yourself the best writer does not mean that you should not write a grant. So one of the things that is hardest to overcome with clients is for you to understand that simple sells, and simple is what gets funded. If your program has 15 steps and it's very convoluted as to how we get to the end result, and you aren't able to tell me about it in a page or less, you are going to struggle for funding. If you have a program like that, you need to take a step back and pull out sections that you can easily talk to a funder about. So, there's basics within every social service agency. You're going to do food distribution, you're going to do, rent and utility assistance, a financial literacy, and then maybe we add on workforce, and then maybe we add on some other components. That's very complicated, and you're more likely to find a funder that is interested in one component versus all of the components. So just because a funder funds general operating doesn't mean that you're likely to get a grant in that if you can't easily tell me what you do, why you do it, and how you get to that end result. So if you feed people, that is very simple. You feed people. Tell me that story, tell me succinctly. That's what gets funded more often than a program with 15 components. Your other kind of tip would be state your ask amount and state it early. So a funder is going to read your proposal differently if you're asking for $5,000 or if you're asking for $500,000. So I want to be able to go in and know this is a $5,000 ask. The history's there, everything's here. I'm going to read that very differently than if I'm reading a $500,000 ask. So if I'm submitting a letter to a funder, I am not going to make it past that second paragraph without stating my amount. First paragraph's who I am, what I'm doing, intro to me. Second paragraph is my amount and how I want them to view that request. Some people will stick that up in a header. However you do it, a funder needs to be able to see that amount and see it quickly. Brings up another point. Do not submit a grant request without an amount. So I'm going to send a letter, it's end of year, and I'm just going to ask for whatever you have to give. No, absolutely not. You're not going to do that with an individual donor. You're not going to do that with a foundation. Show that foundation that you've done your research, you know how much they fund, you know what an appropriate ask amount is, and how that amount fits into making sure that you can run your program. So that ask amount is very important to how they look at your request. And then, just like you went on the first date with the foundation and we were on the phone call, your application is your dating process, right? I don't know what questions they want to know. I'm curious as to how I can answer them. I get a little nervous about it. If a foundation has issued an application, they're telling you those questions that they want to know. They are openly saying, these are the 5 things that are important to me. These are the 5 things I want to know about you. Answer their questions. If they've asked 5 questions, don't give them the answers to 10 questions. Answer what they want to know. They are telling you what's important to them. Similarly, don't make them search for the answer. So if they have a heading that says, I want to know your history, and in your history, I want to know these 5 things, don't give me 2 pages of history where I have to search to see if you included all of that. Bullet point, use headings, short, sweet, succinct answers to each of those things that they want to know. So if they ask the questions in a certain order, I'm going to answer them in that same order. So make it easy for that foundation to see what they want to know. Similarly, as you're answering all of these questions, you're going to see that about 70% of the questions come up application after application after application. You don't need to recreate the wheel every time you answer it. So I create what I call a boilerplate or a template of language, and it has my mission. It has a history section. In that history section, I have a short, medium, and long, things that I typically see within applications of how I'm going to answer these different questions. Same for my program, my needs statement. I redo my needs statement typically once a year when new data's out and I'm pulling new research, and if there's any new theories behind what we've done, or that COVID has obviously changed a lot of the statistics in many areas with social services. So I want to pull all of that new data behind my needs statement for what I'm going to present to my funders. One other tidbit that I would tell you is that attachments matter. A lot of people spend so much time writing that they're down to the deadline and they throw in a few attachments to be able to submit. Your attachments are very, very important. If your request is neat and buttoned up and everything looks pretty, and then you just have random attachments thrown in behind your application, it creates a disconnect for that funder. So once again, go back, look at what the funder wants. They're telling you exactly what they want if they have an application. If they ask for your audit, don't give them a 990. If you don't have an audit, explain why in that attachment, and then include a financial statement. So give them what they want. Don't give them extra. A foundation does not want to have to deal with your 400 pieces of paper when they asked for 3. So follow the directions the best you're given. If there aren't specific guidelines, then look at what that funder could want to know. So with every application, you need to include your IRS letter. They can't fund you without that. Second thing would be a program budget and an org budget are very important to overall looking at your request. If they haven't said, those are typically the 2 things that I include. And then sometimes if I know that my board has a contact, I'll include a board roster to emphasize that extra name recognition. Other than that, I wait for the foundation to reach out to me if they want more detailed information and attachments. But if they ask for attachments and they've stated those attachments in a certain order, include them in that order. So once again, make it as easy for the foundation to go through your information as possible. And then when you're looking through what else to include, spend time on your budgets. So a budget is vitally important to being funded. Your budget needs to tell the same story you told in that grant application, but in numbers. So if I submit a program budget and my total program budget is $200,000, but I've gone to the foundation for $500,000, there's a disconnect. I need that budget to show why that money is important and how it's going to be spent for that funder to buy into my work. Include income and expenses in your program budget. Show what other foundations you're anticipating coming in. Include a line item for that foundation's funding. Show them that you can't make the bottom line without their gift. So make sure that those budgets are in line with what we're asking. Make sure that they tell your story in writing of what it actually costs. Include admin percentages in your program budget. Unless they directly exclude it, it's customary to include some portion of admin in a program budget, because it does take admin to run that program. So up to 20%, include that in an admin line item. Make sure your program budgets include salaries. That's one of the big myths that I hear frequently is this funder doesn't fund, salaries directly, but they'll fund a program. Well, program salaries are part of that. You need to include that in your budget because that shows the funder what it costs. Maybe your expense line items for program supplies are low and your major component is salaries, but make sure you give a full picture of what it costs to run that program to each funder.
Awesome. Okay, we're going to move quickly on this last one because there's some other stuff I want to get to and I want to have time for questions. So Jamie, I'm going to ask you to go fast on our last point here around stewardship and reporting. And this is all about exceeding expectations. So again, similar to an individual donor model, we want to make sure that post-gift, even if they declined you, that we respond appropriately and do all the right things to hopefully get funded in the future. So give us a quick rundown on this, Jamie.
Reporting makes or breaks a second or third gift. If you do not get your reporting done and you do not get it done on time, you have failed at your stewardship. So you should steward one of these donors in the same way you would an individual. I always call after I get a gift. I make sure that a couple months in, I call them with an update about a client that has been successful in our program because of their gift. I make sure that I am following their guidelines, if they want to be added to a newsletter or not, what other touch points might be appropriate. I am also making sure that I have done a phone call before submitting my report. I want them to know a report's coming. Here's what we saw. Here's my report. Within this space, it is harder to get a second gift than it is a third gift. If you have your first gift and you have not stewarded it correctly, that second gift is extremely hard to get. If you get the second gift, it shows that you've stewarded it correctly, and we're more likely to get a third gift. We may have a wait period, but we will see continual funding if you've stewarded that donor correctly.
Awesome. Yes, I love this topic because just like individuals, foundations are very responsive to organizations that do this well. And like Jamie said, it can absolutely put you out of contention for a while if you don't handle this well. So just like that pipeline process, the post-gift communication, I think should also be a part of that timeline. What do we need to do post-gift with reporting and other touch points to make sure that we're stewarding the relationship? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about key stakeholders. And we've identified 4, and you're going to notice that development is not on here. And the reason is because that's the obvious, that somewhere in development, this process is being owned depending on your structure and size. So give us just very quickly, Jamie, thoughts on these 4 non-development stakeholders within an organization.
Almost all the organizations we work with have a disconnect between development and programs. And I'm sure many of you see that in your own organization. You're tasked with raising money, and to do that, you need certain things from program. Program feels like you're putting more work on their plate. So your grant writer becomes your middleman. I have to write a grant application that's strong enough to get me funded while working with programs to determine what they're tracking and what they can report on reasonably for this funder. So make sure your program team is on board with what you're requesting. If you happen to be chasing money and it's not something that programs is normally working on, make sure that they're on board with changing any program components. If you're promising specific things to a funder, make sure that your program team agrees with that and says that they can accomplish it. Your CEO is obviously a very important person to have involved. If they're the person that's going to be doing the site visit, you need to consider how they run their site visit. What are common phrases that they use? What is their cadence? What is their tone? And how do you make your writing match that? So the worst thing that can happen is you have someone come on a site visit, they have this amazing grant application, and it sounds nothing like the person doing the site visit. The way they present your program is completely different than what you presented in writing. So take that into consideration of, is it going to be program doing the site visit? Is it going to be the CEO? CFO is obviously very important when we move back to those budgets and working through what it actually costs to provide your program. I like including in kind in my program budgets because I'm able to tell a funder, look, I can leverage your gift and get this much in kind. If I didn't have this in kind, it would cost me $100,000 more to offer this program. CFO is typically the one that holds that data and holds that knowledge and is going to be able to help you prepare the best budgets possible for submission. And then obviously your board. We work with many organizations where the board struggles with fundraising and they struggle to know their role and they want to be involved, but they don't know how. Distributing these board rosters for your foundations that you're targeting is always an exciting moment for a board that is not experienced with fundraising. They start making connections, they start seeing where they fit within your fundraising, and we've made a connection. Give that board member a script. Make it easy for them, right? They know high level who you are and what you do, or they wouldn't be on your board. But give them a script of how to approach this funder, take some of that nervousness away. I often write first-time emails for board members where I say, this is a script that you can follow for these 3 people. It becomes a great entry point for your board members that are hesitant to launch into fundraising.
Awesome. Yes. Okay. So this is our fun slide. Common myths and mistakes. And I'm going to ask Jamie to just pick like 2 because we're getting close to time and I do want to have time for a question or 2. So I'll put these up, Jamie, and you're going to have to, on the fly here, pick a couple that you think are the most common that you want to spend a little time on.
No means no forever. So if you've done your research and if you started that cultivation process, a no is a no for now. A no is a no for this budget cycle. And we see more than ever before funders coming back with their decline stating lack of resources. And that's the truth. So if you're talking to this foundation and you're building this relationship and they're still saying you're a fit, Go back, ask again. We have some requests that are funded after 3 or 4 asks. They fit everything the funder wanted. They just weren't able to fund them in that cycle. So a no means no for now. I'm going to skip to the last two when we talk about covering a certain percentage from foundations. So the percentage that you should have from foundations varies organization to organization. It should never be the majority of your funding. So grant writing in general is cyclical in nature, and it is not something that's going to make you sustainable. So you must have those individual donors to maintain your stability, and grant writing is something that you should be doing, but it is always something that is going to cycle. So whether it's a funder funds you 1 year and then has a 2-year wait, whether they tell you you're going to have to wait because there were so many other applications, there's always a cyclical nature to foundation funding. So look at that percentage, look at what's right for your organization. If you're over 51% in foundation funding, I start to get nervous for you, because just like if you have 3 individual donors and one of them gives 90% of your money and decides to drop, you're not sustainable. Same with foundations. If one foundation supports you year after year and then they decide to drop off, what does that do to your budget within your organization? So find a percentage that works for you, find a percentage that you can continually hit year after year, develop that pipeline so you know how your funding is going to cycle between your foundations, but do not count on foundations to be the item that makes you sustainable within your fundraising plan.
Yep. Awesome. Okay, well, you'll get the deck so you can look at these later, and we'll have obviously an opportunity for some follow-up. But our last slide here, and then Shannon's going to come back up with a couple questions, is should you outsource? And this is, a question we're posing today because this may be on your minds. This is what Jamie does, and it's something that we are doing together. So we are in a strategic partnership today, Mission Allies and Mission Advancement, where we are serving clients together in certain services, and we are doing that in 2022. So as you think about how you develop a grants plan, just some things to consider that might be appropriate for your organization. So you got to think about whether it's right for a lot of reasons internally that might be a factor. There's multiple skill sets that Jamie talked about today: the research, the writing, reporting. Sometimes that can be done really well by a single person or a team, but this is one way that can also be accomplished, is to outsource a team that has all those skill sets and can manage all of that on your behalf. I mentioned earlier the turnover problem, and we see this a lot with embedded knowledge that leaves with a grant writer where things have not been documented or tracked. So this is a way to kind of mitigate that risk. Depending on if you're growing or sustaining or whatever your strategy is, there needs to be a strategy and somebody pushing and guiding that strategy. So again, another reason why outsourcing could be helpful. You got to think about the cost benefit and the ROI, and that's something that we can talk to you about individually. But I will tell you from working with Jamie that I think many times organizations can outsource for less than they can pay a full-time grant writer at certain levels. So this may just even be a cost savings to your organization. And the last thing I'll say is that you cannot outsource relationships. So just like working with Mission Advancement on a project, if you know us in this way, we don't bring you donors, we don't go ask for money for you, but we do bring strategy. In Jamie's case, there's a lot of legwork that's done on the writing side and the research side, but ultimately the relationships that she mentioned are between organization and funder. And it's just kind of guiding that process and assisting along the way and bringing the strategy to the table. So if you're interested in exploring this with us, as Shannon mentioned, you'll get an opportunity to sign up for a consultation, and we'd be happy to talk to you more about what that might look like for your organization as you're thinking about 2022. So I'm going to have Shannon come back on with a question or two. I think we've got maybe 5 or 10 minutes.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much. This was very informative. If you have a question, go ahead and put those into the questions panel. We do have a few, so we'll try to get to as many of these as we can before our time is up. The first question comes from Jim, and he says, how does this strategy apply to foundation giving within the context of a capital campaign? So Jamie, I'm going to pass that to you first.
Okay. If you've never grant written before, a capital campaign is typically not the place to start. So one of the things that we see with most capital funders is that you've had some history with them in the past. And so caveat being, there are some foundations that just fund capital, and those are organizations that we're going to target for a capital campaign. For organizations that fund in multiple areas, they'll fund Gen Op, they'll fund program, and they'll fund capital. We typically see that capital gets funded after you've built a request pipeline with them. So you've been funded a couple times in program, and now they're willing to come on with you for a capital ask. Most of the time within a capital campaign, your foundations are going to be structured. Once again, build a relationship, ask them where they want to come in, but typically we see that foundations come in after 20% is raised. They rarely want to be first gift in. Then there's another group of foundations that like to come in after 40% is raised, so you're almost halfway there. And then there's another group that like to come in at 60%. Those are ones that want to see you're far along in your campaign, and some of those want to be a closing gift. So timeline your foundations out, do your research, who you're going to ask. It is rare to have a capital campaign that is just foundation giving. There's always going to be that individual component, and foundations want to see that you have that component to a campaign to make it sustainable.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Anne asked, can you give some guidance on how to rekindle a lapsed relationship with a former funder now that there's new leadership and you don't know why the relationship faded?
Just like any other relationship, you have to acknowledge that there was a lapse and use that new leader as your reason for reaching out. So anytime you have a change in leadership, it's a wonderful touch point. If it's a new development director, a new CEO, whatever that staff change is, we want that relationship to be with the organization. We don't want our relationship to leave with a staff member. So you have to fix the relationship. We don't know what we're trying to fix. So this is a great reach out for that new individual to say, hey, I'm new at the organization. I wanted to learn from you about what your funding history was in the past and how we can rekindle this relationship, or how we can be a new grantee with you. So it's acknowledging that there was an issue and then using that introduction as your launching point.
That's great. This next question says, how would you recommend handling declines that are sent from a portal or do not reply email address, such as Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, so larger foundation or corporate philanthropic arms?
So with Bank of America, if you go into that right sidebar, you'll be able to click through several documents to see who manages that fund. And then there's always an email address for that person. If it's a general email, ask around. You'll always be able to find their actual email. But I always want to respond to a decline, right? I want to say thank you for your consideration. They took the time to read my request. They took the time to decide whether or not I was a good fit this year. So even with those corporate, you can find out. So JP Morgan, it's on their website as well. You'll be able to dig through to find out who manages those funds, just to send a quick email thank you note. I don't have much luck with paper thank yous for a lot of those corporate groups. I do paper thank yous for a lot of my family foundations, but you have to dig just a little bit, but the information's there for you to shoot an email to them.
That's great. The thing I would add to that, Shannon, because we talked a lot about the board relationships, and a lot of times in those corporate settings, there might be a board connection. And Jamie, I don't know if you would agree, but my instinct would be, if you have that, like, ask your board member to call that other person and just, again, say, thank you, we received the decline. And if you have any other feedback for us, we'd love to hear it.
And most foundations are hesitant to give you true feedback, which I think is one of the greatest challenges within grant writing. If you would, give me that true feedback, it's challenging. The few that do give you true feedback, They rarely say there was anything wrong with your request or anything wrong with how you wrote it. It just didn't rise to the top of the stack at the board meeting. So you take that knowledge and you say, okay, what did they fund this year? They didn't fund me. How do I position myself differently for a second ask with them? And most of the time it does just come down to money. I think if foundations had more to give, they would fund all of the great causes that are out there. But asking for that honest feedback never hurts. It's honestly rare that you get it, but if you do, it's a helpful nugget moving forward.
Great. Do you recommend using iWave as another database? Is that a better tool for larger or smaller organizations?
No, that's not one I'm familiar with.
Okay.
To be honest, I would say any database that helps you get closer to where you need to be. So it can, if you're starting out and you're using an Excel spreadsheet, you're in a great spot. If you are a multi-million-dollar organization and you are still using an Excel spreadsheet, it is not easy to manage. So having somewhere to store that data that's going to transition with either staff members or just a knowledge base, whatever works for you is better than nothing.
Great. And our last question before we hit the top of the hour is, if a foundation does not respond to your calls or emails, how many times or how frequently do you keep trying?
It's a tough balance, to be honest. There are some foundations. So I'm here in Dallas. There's a notorious foundation here that if you ever get them on the phone, they will tell you, I don't like calls. I will literally never fund you. That is not a foundation that's ever going to build a relationship with you. And so at some point you have to say, I might target them for a one-time gift because it's the cost of mailing a letter, but that is not someone that's going to be included in my true relational grant strategy. So if that is a funder that you learn from your peers that they're willing to talk to you and work with you after you submit an application or after you're funded, then that may be someone that you go back to multiple times. But if you hear from your peers that they mailed you a check and they still won't pick up the phone, that's not someone that you're going to be able to truly steward through a relational model. So while the money's nice and maybe we apply a couple times, it is not where the majority of your focus should be, because it's unlikely that you're going to be able to grow that gift through a relationship. And that didn't really answer your question because it is hard to know how many times to go back. I've gone back 6 times to a funder where I know I fit their sweet spot. And I know that if I can get them to award my application, I can build a relationship. And it happened to be that the request was funded on the 6th ask. So that's 6 years of asking to get an award to build a relationship. But it was a foundation that I felt very strongly was a match for that client. So I think it just takes some common sense of I'm not a shoe-in, I'm kind of a stretch and I've applied 2 or 3 times, then pull them off your list. It's probably not a good match at that time.
I would, we said this earlier. I mean, there's so many similarities here with individuals, but the difference here is, like Jamie said earlier, they are in the business of giving money away. That is why they exist. Unlike an individual, for where philanthropy is, a much more kind of emotional or personal thing, this is a business. So I would say be bold. And like Jamie said, if their sweet spot in terms of focus and types of funding they do, I think continuing to make the appropriate phone calls or emails doesn't hurt, because you never know. You're not pestering somebody's personal pocketbook. This is a business that's in the market for this reason. And if you're a fit for them, I would keep trying until they tell you to stop.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for joining us today. This was extremely informative, and I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. We wish you a very happy holiday season and Happy New Year, and we will join you again with our next webinar in 2022. Please be on the lookout for an email from me with a recording of today's session, as well as the slides and that link to the free 30-minute consultation. So if you want to dive deeper into any of the topics that Jamie and Jennifer talked about today, there's no obligation, no strings attached. We would love to help you with your grant strategy for 2022. And we just wish you a very happy holidays. Merry Christmas. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.